Decentralization of power in Turkey is the topic of today's video. Welcome to Radio Rebellion. Since we're talking about the centralization of power in Turkey today, means we actually talk about the continued centralization tendencies over time and the development of the unitary state system and why the unitary state in comparison to other geographies is implemented in Turkey in a very specific way. Okay, so let's start. Let me start my argumentation with the Ottomans because I did so in the previous videos. In public discourse, you might have heard that since the Ottoman Empire was huge and different local communities were living within the borders of the Ottoman Empire, the local communities had a lot of competences to govern themselves. But according to some scholars, this has in fact not been the case, and already under the Ottoman rule, centralization tendencies were strong. I mean, at least, and this is the crucial point, at the legislative level. Informally, of course, it is possible, and I also believe so, because I have had many conversations with people who are well read in this topic, and in fact, on the ground, it might always indeed have been that they could govern themselves, but on the legislative level, in fact, only in competences were granted to local communities only in the 1870 Province Act, so it was not that long before the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. But now let's talk about decentralization of power under the Kemalist establishment. And for those who are not familiar with modern Turkish history, Kemalist, now something I need to check the camera. Okay, for those who are not familiar with modern Turkish history, Kemalist, why Kemalist the name? Because of Kemal Mustafa Atatürk. It was the president of the Turkish Republic since 1923, and this is why, the people following in his trajectory, they are all we call them Kemalist establishment. It's just the people following in his footsteps, following in his trajectory, okay? So this is why Kemalist, for those who are not familiar with modern Turkish history. Okay, so centralization of power under Kemalists. Actually, as I already mentioned in another video, after the First World War, in 1918, the Ottomans lost a huge amount of territory and became the foundation of the modern Turkish Republic. Now they lost huge amounts of territory, and everything that remained of their empire was the territory that is nowadays modern Turkey. And because of that, they wanted to centralize power after these historical events because they were afraid of further loss of territory, my dear friends and listeners, okay? So the main reason for the extreme centralization under the Kemalist rule was the loss of territory, and therefore the administrative reforms aimed at centralizing power and at inhibiting local self-government, because they were also afraid that if, competences, authority, political, financial, competences were given to local communities to govern themselves, that they will lose more territory, that separatist movements will be fooled, will be enhanced or will be supported by these political opportunity structures. And so this was the main reason why they implemented the unitary state system in Turkey in a very extreme fashion, okay? Or why this is the reason for the extreme centralization tendencies in Turkey. Now, how did they do that? They did so by implementing certain legislations, such as the 1930 municipal law. Thereby, they were with the introduction of this law, they were taking away competences from municipalities and provinces to govern themselves. And as a consequence, provinces and municipalities were only considered from that moment onwards as an extension of the central government. So they basically only had public service delivery function from that moment onwards. This means that, and we are especially talking of Kurdish provinces here, because they were mainly, the Kemalist establishment was mainly afraid of the Kurds and Kurdish self-government. So this means that they were rendered dependent from the central government, politically, financially, institutionally. Basically, they needed to ask the central government for permission for every move that they made, and were actually unable to do anything. Now, how did the Kemalist establishment legitimize these political moves? They legitimized it with the modernization discourse, basically claiming, we should do this because we care for our nation. And by implementing this law, we save them from the ill effect of traditions. But what was the response from the local Kurdish, especially Kurdish? Now something is with my camera, my dear friends and listeners. Now, what was the response from Kurdish leaders, tribesmen, religious leaders, etc.? The response was neglect. They were obviously against these political moves from the center, but, this was ignored, and this modernization project has nevertheless been implemented top down, and this is actually still the case nowadays, but I will talk about that in a minute. The consequences are obviously that Kurdish political leaders have no influence in Turkish politics, that they are rendered extremely dependent. So basically they are colonized, so you can say. In other words, they are being colonized and rendered dependent. It's the same, these are always the same dynamics everywhere when it comes to colonization. Colonization always means making people dependent. This is also what happens actually there. You may phrase it differently or frame it differently, but in the end, it's colonization. Yeah, I think I covered it all, my dear friends and listeners. Now, this also meant that I want to add that, for example, the fact that for the municipal law they were rendered politically and financially dependent from the central government also meant that they could not use their own resources for own infrastructural projects, etc., because the surplus of their tax money and whatever, of their financial resources were always transferred to the central government, Yeah, that is it. But now let's talk about AKP government and the centralization of power under the AKP government. Did the same trajectory continue? This is the question. Yes, my dear friends, the same strategies continued of centralization of power continued under the AKP government, but now the only difference was that, the AKP government also had to deal with the EU accession negotiations, and therefore they were a little bit more constricted. For them it was basically not that easy to make all these political moves, because due to these negotiations, their moves were monitored. And of course, if you want to access the EU, there are the Copenhagen criteria. These are criteria for candidate states that they need to fulfill in order to become part of the European Union. These are human rights criteria. These are economic criteria that candidate states need to fulfill. And yeah, so now in the framework of the EU accession negotiation, Turkey also ratified in 1992 the European Charter of Local Self-Government, okay? They ratified this document, but as we all know, the ratification of certain political deals and, what's happening on ground are always completely different things. Of course, as the same as when it comes to the treatment of refugees and minorities, they did not implement the decentralization, they didn't do anything for decentralization of power to happen. And as a consequence, one second. Yeah, it's important to mention that the explanation that they gave for why they do not implement these laws is that they claimed or argued, this is in contradiction with our principle of the indivisibility of the state. So this is the explanation that they give, and they continued under AKP rule also the centralization tendencies continued to see decentralization as a security threat and continued to render provinces and municipalities, especially the eastern provinces, municipalities in Turkey, meaning the Kurdish areas, dependent financially, politically. Therefore, they remained weak. And let me see, is there anything else to cover, my dear friends and listeners? Yeah, and also they continued to monitor and to supervise all of their actions, so basically, they're not free to govern themselves at all. Yeah, that was it. Is there anything else to add? Let me see, my dear friends and listeners. All right, I think maybe it's also interesting to know that within the timeline I draw here and what I explained, there has been one moment where this centralization tendencies have been lifted. This was in the 1917 economic crisis, and because of this crisis, neoliberal economic reforms have been introduced in Turkey, and as a consequence of these reforms, the supervision of the provinces and municipalities in Turkey, has been lifted a little bit, and in this time period, they used it, the Kurdish leaders used it as a political opportunity structure. They have been able to, do some good, govern themselves, a little bit better. But in the 1980s, then again, there was a coup, and the military junta introduced a new constitution in which now the centralization, of provinces and municipalities got strengthened again. And but that was about like a 10-year or maybe less. I don't know exactly how many years it was, but there was a small time period where this strict centralization rules have been lifted a bit because of neoliberal economic reforms. Tendentially, one could say actually neoliberal reforms usually always backfired for Kurdish people, but in this specific in this situation, it actually had also for once positive effects for them. But I think it's enough for today. This was it about the centralization of power in Turkey, the unitary state system in Turkey. And I hope it was interesting. I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.